Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Deans, and I am a postdoc in Dr. Vera Krichik's lab at the University of Minnesota. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about scale insects, and particularly those species that are common pests in greenhouse systems, and also discuss a little bit about how to manage them in these systems. So we're all very aware of the threat that exotic pests and invasive species can have to native systems. But I think, typically we're used to thinking about the impact of exotics in areas where we live. But it's important to acknowledge that, we can also be a source for invasive species traveling to other parts of the world. And of course, invasive species that also can move within North America as well. So some examples of some of these species from North America that have spread to other areas include monarch butterflies, which have spread to Hawaii, to the Pacific Islands, Australia, and actually, interestingly, are in space aboard the International Space System, where they're doing some research with them and different various effects of microgravity. Although I doubt that it's a very high risk for them to sort of become established in space. Japanese beetle is another pest that actually is invasive in North America, but it has been here so long that it's been able to actually move to other areas from here in sort of secondary type of secondary invasion. So it's becoming a more serious pest in Europe, specifically in Italy, where it's a problematic at airports because the way that the beetles aggregate onto plane wheel hubs and things like that. But it also can be problematic for plants and crops. The pine tortoise scale, which is native to the US, has also spread very recently to Italy, where it's been infesting these umbrella pines that are found throughout the city center of Rome. And so this is actually quite a large problem because these infestations can actually kill these trees within a couple of years. And so they've really been trying to use some biocontrol measures to figure out how to manage this particular pest. So when we talk about scales, we're referring to insects that are in the order Hemiptera. So they were at a later time placed into this other group, Homoptera, which has since been sort of placed as a suborder within Hemiptera. But this is the order that has a lot of different types of sucking pests in it, including aphids and things like that. And so scales are quite similar in many ways and in many aspects of their biology to aphids and mealybugs. There's three sort of general types of scale insects. We have the armored scales, which are the family Diaspididae. We have soft scales, which are Coccidae, and then we have belt scales, which are Ericoccidae family. And so for soft scales, this is a list that shows the species that are commonly problematic in a few different systems here. So in greenhouse systems, brown soft scale, the black scale, and the hemispherical scales can be problematic under these sorts of growing conditions. For landscape plants, the cottony maple scale, European fruit licanium scale, Fletcher scale, the pine tortoise scale, which we already talked about, that's invasive in Italy, Bruce bud scale, tulip tree scale, calico scale can be found as pests in these systems. And then for felt scales, Eurococcidae, they can be this particular species, a European elm scale, can be quite problematic. So this shows a picture of the tulip tree scale, which is a type of soft scale. And so the interesting thing with scales is that there's a large amount of difference in size between the different sexes. So you can see here the females, which are much bigger. And these are really the types of insects that you're going to see on the trees when you are looking for infestation. They're much bigger. They have this, they tend to be very oval or round in shape. And they have this sort of waxy covering that actually covers the insect itself. So you can't really see the body of the insect in a classic way. What you end up seeing is this shell that covers over the female. Now the males are much, much smaller. And you can see here, they look a lot more similar to what we think of as what a typical insect looks like. They're rarely seen in nature because they're quite small and evasive. They only live for a couple days after they close as adults. And so what we more typically see are these round scale-like structures on branches and leaves and things like that. Interesting thing about scales is also that, so the females have legs and are able to move around in the immature stage, which we refer to as crawlers. And so they're kind of difficult to see in this picture. We'll see them in the next one. These crawlers, essentially, they hatch out from eggs, which are laid underneath the female's waxy shell, and they're able to move around, move to other parts of the plant host. Sometimes wind can disperse them to other plants because they are so small. And essentially, once they find a host, they start to feed, and over time, they go through 2 more instars. Typically, they build their own waxy covering. And eventually, for soft scales, their legs and the antenna become much, much more reduced. They're not completely absent, but they are minimized upon the final molt. And so the adults don't really move after this point, except for, of course, the males. So here's another example. It might be a little bit better here to see the females, so you can see their round shape with this waxy coating. Might be able to see some crawlers in there. They're much smaller. Oftentimes their coloration is different than the adults. And then this just shows the male pupal covers. So males go through more of a complete sort of metamorphosis. So they do have this pupal stage, pupal-like stage, where they have their own type of cover. This is an example in of a tulip tree scale again, which tends to infest linden and walnut trees. Here is a picture of actually a felt scale. So this shows, this is European elm scale, which shows the female adults, which are much bigger here than you can see, than the crawlers, which are shown here. So these are the immatures that hatch out in association with the females and then move to other parts of the plant or other plants themselves. And so scales, soft scales anyway, feed on the phloem of the plant. And so they can secrete honeydew, which is also typical of aphids, which can cause additional issues on the plant, such as mold growth and things like that. So those were the soft scales. So we're going to talk about these armored scales, which are very similar in biology, but there are some key differences between armored scales and soft scales. So this is the Diaspididae family. In terms of greenhouse pests, the 2 main species are this Bouderball scale and the fern scale. And then, of course, there's a much longer list of armored scales that can infect various landscape plants. So armored scales, which are shown here, this is a unanimous scale, and you can see here the females. So they look quite similar. The shape's slightly different for this particular species for the females, but again, they form this waxy covering, scale-like covering that that covers over the female. And then here you can see Looks like these are probably aphids, not crawlers. But you can see how they lay quite flush against the plant, and sometimes can be quite cryptic and difficult to see. So the soft scales that we talked about, the body of the actual female insect under the waxy coating is actually attached to the waxy coating. So if you're able to pull a soft scale off a plant, you should be able to see the insect underneath. For armored scales, they're actually not attached physically to their waxy coating. So if you pull a scale off, it's not necessarily going to take the insect off with it. Another difference between armored scales and soft scales is that armored scales are not phloem feeders. They actually feed on plant parenchyma cells. So they'd be considered cell rupture feeders, cell components. And we'll talk about why that's important when we get to the management slides. So here's an example of a pubescent Kermes scale. So this is on oak. So you can see that given the shape of this particular species and the fact that it's feeding on the vein on the leaf, it tends to have this sort of gall-like structure. So it can be difficult sometimes to identify this particular species because it doesn't necessarily look like an insect. It looks like a gall that's perhaps made by an insect. All right, so some general characteristics of both types of scales. We talked about some of these. They have these, they're sucking bugs, so they have these long stylet mouth parts, which they're able to pierce the plant and either tap into the phloem or just different plant cells. And essentially, they exude proteolytic saliva typically into these plant structures, which helps digest the plant sort of outside of the insect. And then they're able to suck in those contents. So either the phloem or whatever the contents of the plant cells are. We talked about how males are much smaller than females as adults, but they also have different shaped covers. So those male pupil covers, which we saw, which are more white and tend to be more oval. Males, because they are so small on their wing, they can look a lot like male aphids. The crawler stages are the immature stage. And again, these are the only stage that's actually mobile for scale insects. And so they can disperse, find other parts of the plant. As is often the case with sucking insects, typically you need a rather high populations for it to have perceptible damaging effects on plants. So in high densities, scale insects are really a problem or can be a problem. They can kill certain parts of the plant, such as branches or leaves. And we'll see some slides that show the damage later. Again, eggs are typically laid underneath the female's covering where they hatch out, become crawlers. They can disperse, and then they tend to go through one or two more nymphal instars before they become adults, where they either show reduced legs and antennae, such as in soft scales, or actually completely lose the function of their legs and antennae, which is more typical in armored scales as adults. I should mention that the reproduction, their type of reproduction can vary. Most of the scale species that are pests tend to reproduce sexually. However, there are some species that are parthenogenic, meaning the females give live birth to essentially clones of themselves. And so this is an adaptation that can cause populations to grow very quickly under the right conditions. And so here's just some kind of more specific differences between armored and soft scales. So we talked about the soft cover, the waxy covering, whether or not it's attached to the scale. So for soft scales, we said it is attached to the body. If you can pull the scale off, you actually have the insect attached to that particular structure. But this is not the case for armored scales. Eggs are laid in sac-like structures for both types of scales. They do overwinter in different stages. So for soft scales, they tend to overwinter as mated second instars, so mated immature scales. But for armored scales, they tend to overwinter as eggs, oftentimes under the female's waxy coating to sort of protect them. In terms of when the immatures are out moving around, crawlers of armored scales tend to be present April through June. So sort of just during the late spring, early summer. For soft scales, crawlers can appear from April to August. So it's much kind of longer of a period. We talked about the ability to move after once they reach the adult stage. So armored scales, no, they pretty much lose their legs and antenna. Soft scales can technically, but they really don't tend to move very much. It's quite rare. Honeydew production. So soft scales, because they are feeding on the phloem, they do produce honeydew, which can cause other problems with the host plants. However, armored scales do not, because again, they're feeding on these parenchyma cells. So not really a high sugar resource. All right, so in terms of managing scale insects, there's a couple options. Because they secrete this waxy coating, the use of sort of typical insecticides can be quite difficult because they're so well protected from any kind of foliar spray that you might use. So really being able to physically remove them from the plant is a really effective option if possible, if the infestation isn't too crazy. But what you can do is you can really just physically prune and remove parts of the host plant that are infested with scales. So you can prune branches, twigs, leaves, and that can be effective if that's possible. If scale numbers are low enough, you can, like I mentioned, physically pick them off. However, we talked about how soft scales are attached to the actual waxy coating, armored scales aren't. So it depends what type of scale you have in terms of how effective this might be. Of course, if you have armored scales and you remove their waxy coating, then you can treat them with other chemicals a lot more effectively because they're not protected anymore. So you can dab individuals with alcohol or some sort of neem-based product. But again, this is really only going to be an option if you have a very low infestation. So if you catch infestation early. To sort of prevent the spread of scale insects, you can use double-sided tape, other types of sticky barriers that are going to prevent the crawlers from dispersing on a plant. In terms of chemicals, you should be able to use some sort of insect growth regulator that will affect the development of the immature stage. And you can also use, in some cases, systemic insecticides such as imidacloprid. But again, this isn't going to work for armored scales because they're feeding on just the cell contents. And so systemic insecticides will be found in the phloem and potentially the xylem, other parts of the plants, but they're not going to be present in specific plant cells. So these aren't really options for armored scales, but can be used for soft scales. For armored scales, there are some other chemical options, but as we mentioned, it can be very hard to make effective contact with scales and these chemicals because of their waxy coating. So here's just a a table that kind of shows some of the insect growth regulators that can be used for scale insects. So you can see some of these are, the mode of action is to mimic a juvenile hormone, so it really prevents them from developing. Other types of chemicals here, chitinase inhibitors, which disrupt their ability to molt properly, and then also this ecdysin antagonist, which again just really sort of messes up the hormonal signaling that's required for them to go through full development. So now I just want to go through a couple of specific species that are common pests in greenhouse systems. So just talk a little bit about their life history traits, how to manage them. So we'll start with the brown soft scale, which again, this is the family Coccidae. And this shows a picture of them. So they are brown as you would expect. You can see here, it looks as if the females here are feeding on sort of a leaf vein, which makes sense given that, again, they're phloem feeders. This particular species is quite prolificous, so it can feed on hundreds of different types of plants, but it is partial to perennials and things like ferns. You can see the crawlers here are kind of more yellow colored than the females. So again, as mentioned, the crawlers, the immatures are born underneath the female covers, which provide them a certain amount of protection in this stage. The damage that's associated with this species, and we'll see a general trend across these species, it tends to be very similar types of damage. Stunted growth of the plant, wilting, leaf drop, so abscission of leaves, and then also, as we mentioned, the production of this really sticky honeydew substance that can be made more obvious by the growth of things like sooty mold that tends to kind of make leaves look really black colored. So here in this picture, you can sort of see the sheen that this leaf sort of has because of the honeydew being produced by these scales as they're feeding on the phloem and getting rid of the excess sugars. The best way to monitor for brown soft scale is to just look for the scale insects or to look for the damage. As we talked about, you can use cultural control methods to just remove infested plants. So things like sanitation, pruning, any branches or leaves that are infested, or just getting rid of individual plants if that's possible to prevent the spread. Otherwise, you can use oils and systemic insecticides such as imidacloprid can be used for soft scales. But anything that's dependent on the chemical actually coming in contact with the insect is going to be problematic because of these coverings that they have. For some of these species, we'll see that some biocontrol has been effective. This shows a scale that you can see a parasitoid exit hole here. So for the brown soft scale, there's a couple different beetle species that has been used for biocontrol, shown here. And then also, it looks like two Metaphicus species that have been used as parasitic wasps, if that's something that's possible to use. Hemispherical scale, so this again is another type of soft scale. You can see it's a little more lightly colored than the brown scale, and they tend to have these kind of ridges on the ends of the waxy coating that can look sort of like a letter H is on the back. Again, the species, it feeds on many plants, bamboo, croton, ferns again, different types of shrubs and flowers. So this is one of those species that I mentioned is parthenogenic. So it actually gives birth to clones of the mother. So it lays eggs, which hatch under the female cover, and then the female actually dies, and they sort of use her covering for protection. Damage to look for, again, honeydew, sooty mold, or as we can see in these pictures, on certain plants, it's quite easy to see infestation of this particular species because it is more lightly colored and larger. And again, you can remove infested parts of plants. You can use oils, systemic insecticides, as we talked about. And it does look like there are some biocontrol options, a beetle here, and then also parasitic wasp option for this particular species. All right, another type of scale, and this one is an armored scale here, so a Diaspididae, a Baudeval scale, which we can see here is a little bit more lightly colored. So these tend to be white or light yellow, almost transparent. They tend to infest things like orchids, palms, banana, and cactus. So not quite as broad of a host range. In a greenhouse system, this particular species takes about 50 days to complete its life cycle, and females can produce up to 200 eggs in a lifetime. So populations can grow quite quickly. You can see the species is actually quite cryptic here, so it can be really difficult to see scale insects on, especially like parts of the plants that are brown, but you should be able to identify damage by looking at the leaves, so looking for chlorotic spots or leaf abscission, things like that. You can also, obviously, the crawlers are going to be a lot easier to see because they are mobile than the adults. For this particular species, prevention is really going to be the best option because, as we talked about, you can't really use systemic insecticides on armored scales because they'll never actually come in contact with them. So if you can just make sure to buy plants from a supplier that doesn't have scale infestation, that would be best. Otherwise, as we mentioned, again, you can try and use oils, other insecticides that you can try to apply to the scales, but this can be often difficult to get through their waxy coating. Fern scale, so this is another armored scale, and we didn't really talk too much about this, but these have kind of a different type of covering here. So the scales we've seen so far have had sort of a really smooth, sort of aerodynamic look, but there are some scale species that the waxy coating that they exude actually looks more like filaments, and it tends to look almost like a fluffy substance, something like cotton or something like that. And so they tend to look a little bit more like mealybugs, which we'll talk a little bit about. But this is one of those species here, the fern scale, where it's very brightly colored. It's easy to see. It's a stark white, and it almost looks like some type of cotton covering over them. This particular species infests fern and citrus and a couple other hosts. Again, the females lay eggs under their coverings. So you can see this female actually is quite dark colored, and the males are the ones that tend to have that white, more white covering. And so it says here that the first instar crawlers are active, and the males actually emerge from second instar armor, and they're the ones that crawl around, are able to fly and mate with the females. So damage for this species is going to be chlorotic spots on the leaves again, and just generally reduced vigor. Monitoring, it's easiest to look for the crawlers because they're easy to see, but these male You can see that the male covers tend to stand out quite a bit also. So again, if you can purchase from a supplier that doesn't have an infestation, that's going to be a great option, particularly because fern scales tend to infest ferns, which are more sensitive than maybe other hosts to chemicals. So, you know, for this species, your options are potentially further reduced in terms of chemical control. All right, so we talked a little bit about how some of these scale insects can look a lot like mealybugs, and that's because they're actually very similar to mealybugs. Taxonomically, mealybugs are considered a separate, separate family, so they're the Pseudococcidae family. But biologically, scales and mealybugs are quite similar. One difference is that mealybugs do tend to remain mobile as adults, whereas most scales adults, females, do not move. And so this is an example of a citrus mealybug, which again has this kind of a coating that looks a lot more like fluffier, like filaments, less like a smooth, waxy covering. Again, for mealybugs, males tend to be much smaller and winged. Crawlers are much smaller and tend to be a different color. So this picture shows an adult female here, and then a nymph, so an immature, and then also the crawlers, which are the most immature mobile stage. So citrus mealybugs, they feed on plant hosts from 27 different families, so they are quite prolificous. Again, we talked about females, they produce these ovisacs, which crawlers hatch out of. Again, males are rarely seen because they are small and winged, so they're difficult to really see in the field or in the greenhouse. Typical damage of citrus mealybugs can be distorted growth on plants. Again, leaf drop. Because citrus mealybugs is a phloem feeder, again, you might see honeydew or sooty mold. And sometimes you might actually see sort of this accumulation of the waxy, cottony sort of substance on parts of the plants when you have high infestation. So you can remove infested plants or infested parts of plants as a type of cultural control. Because mealybugs are phloem feeders, you can use systemic insecticides and of course things like oils. And there are some options for biological control. So again, there's some lady beetles and parasitic wasps that will parasitize this species. This picture shows a beetle, particular beetle species here, as an adult. And interestingly, the larval stage of this beetle is sort of meant to, it looks a lot like just a larger version of these citrus mealybugs. So that's pretty interesting. It's sort of a cryptic morphology. Long-tailed mealybug, again, these look kind of similar to citrus mealybugs, but they have these longer sort of tails on the end, and they also have the filaments on the side protrude a little bit more. So again, this is not a scale species. It's a mealybug. It's a Pseudococcidae family, but very similar biology as scales, and so because of that, the management tends to be very similar. You can see here, adult females have 17 pairs of these filaments. Males are, again, small and winged. Long-tailed mealybugs have many different plant hosts. Females give birth to live young on sort of the fluffy wax that they produce. Again, damage is going to be distorted growth because they're phloem feeders, honeydew, accumulation of this fluffy wax-like substance. And again, you should be able to see, I mean, even though adult mealybugs are mobile, the immature stages tend to be a lot more active. So they might be easier to see, although to be honest, these mealybugs do stand out quite a bit because of the their type of covering is sort of obvious. So again, similar suggestions for management: remove infested plants, systemic insecticides. There are again biocontrol options for long-tailed mealybug. The last species we're going to talk about are these root mealybugs. So these are kind of interesting because they don't really infest the above ground section of plants. They actually are found in the root balls underground. So because of this, they can be more difficult to see, obviously, unless you're actually looking for them. But again, you can see they have this white kind of covering. They have these filaments. Actually, they can form a type of netting underground also. They're found in many different types of plants that tend to be grown in greenhouses, including many different types of flowers listed here. Their eggs are laid again in an ovisac, similarly to scales, and all stages are pretty much found underground on the roots, and sometimes in potting mix and things. They can be transferred across greenhouses. So the damage, so what you might notice, because you can't really see them above ground, is just devitalization of the plant, deterioration of the leaves. If plants are dying and there's really no other obvious reason why, you might have to check for these mealybugs in the soil. Obviously, you do this by examining the root ball, and it should be easy to see. Also, if you have a lot of, if ants are present, it could be an indication of mealybugs, because again, ants typically feed on the honeydew that they produce. And if you do find infestation, obviously remove infested plants and try and use clean soil to make sure that you're not transferring or allowing them to disperse into any other potted plants. But again, systemic insecticides can also be effective for these species. So that could be a good option. All right, and that's all I have for the scale insect presentation. If you have any questions, you can contact me through the MNLA site, and thank you.